Hello, everyone. It is a great pleasure and indeed a great privilege for me to be here today, taking part in this global conversation of individuals, groups, and communities from across the planet. As many of you, of course, know, the acute crises of recent years, as well as the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, have led to calls for a new eco-social contract that protects our natural environment and that leaves no one behind. For instance, in response to the catastrophic inequalities exposed and amplified by the pandemic, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called, as he puts it, for a new global deal to build back a more equitable and sustainable future. And of course, several conveners of this summit have echoed this call for a genuinely inclusive eco-social contract that promotes the well-being of all people and protects our common homeland. But as many of these calls recognize, the realization of a new social contract will depend on the relationships, solidarities, and identities that support and sustain it. In other words, what matters is not just the rights, responsibilities, principles, and objectives that we enumerate in such a contract, but also the relationships and sense of shared identity that motivate a deep and solidaristic commitment to the realization of those objectives. What I want to do in this talk is to take seriously these social and relational foundations of a transformative social change and ask, what would it mean to reimagine and recast our shared identities and relationships in such a way that they not only can support and sustain a new eco-social contract, but much more radically in such a way that they might fundamentally transform and reconstitute the eco-social world that we all inhabit. When the required social and relational foundations of a new social contract are considered, one proposal that naturally emerges is that a globally inclusive human collective identity is needed to match the globally inclusive planetary scope of this reimagined contract. In other words, what we need in this age of profound crisis and interdependence is a social or collective identity. I use these terms interchangeably, a social or collective identity rooted in the recognition of our fundamental oneness as human beings. Now, even those of you who might be enthusiastic about the power and possibility of such an identity will know that the idea arouses significant objections and concerns. Putting aside the charge of utopianism, two key critiques are generally leveled against the idea of a universal human collective identity. The first, and I think most notable, is that such an identity poses a significant threat to human diversity. Skeptics worry that universalism, and in particular the ideal of human oneness, carries an inherent risk of homogeneity, typically Western-centric homogeneity, propagated through a variety of means, including direct and indirect forms of imperial or neo-imperial coercion. And I think, needless to say, this is a very legitimate worry. Both human history and our collective present validate the concern that universalist, or perhaps I should say ostensibly universalist projects, can stifle and oppress the diversity of humanity's particular identities, experiences, and attachments. A second and related core objection claims that a universal human identity cannot really amount to much more than an overly rational commitment to some cold and rational abstraction. In other words, far from the warm and meaningful belonging that we derive from our other identities, a universal human identity is empty and rootless. It yields a life that is deprived of all the tangible meaning and texture and color that our associations with particular communities and identities provide. A popularized version of this objection is the charge of elitism. If a cosmopolitan identity can work for anyone, this objection goes, it only works for a very small, out of touch, typically smug group of frequent flyers sitting in an exclusive airport lounge on their way to Davos. So the crux of these core objections is that a deeply internalized, deeply felt, solidaristic sense of human oneness, that is a thickly conceived universal human identity, could only come at the cost of humanity's essential diversity. This overarching critique of universalism, as you might know, reflects a broader and quite long-standing social and philosophical tension between the universal and the particular, or between humanity's unity and its diversity. A tension that, I would add, has become especially acute and palpable in this age of increasingly profound and radical planetary interdependence. I'm going to address these objections directly and make the case that, far from threatening the essential diversity of humankind, a thickly conceived, all-encompassing universal human identity is in fact uniquely equipped to fundamentally resolve this long-standing tension between the oneness and the diversity of humankind. Before I state my argument more elaborately, however, I want to observe that the particular identities and affiliations that we value and whose diversity we wish to promote, those traditional identities are themselves, needless to say, not without crisis and complication. In fact, our traditional social or collective identities are characterized by two contrasting aspects, which are in a chronic and unstable tension with one another. As the philosopher Martha Nussbaum puts this point, social identity is Janus-based. It proves a formula for both inclusion and exclusion. On the one hand, bounded social identities, that is, identities that include some and exclude others, are deeply susceptible to instability, conflict, and destructiveness. As one recent commentary states, identities can be horsemen of the apocalypses from apartheid to genocide. But on the other hand, collective identities are indispensable. The diversity they represent delivers strength and resilience to social systems. Collective identities bind us together in moral and social enterprises. And of course, at a micro level, our particular perspectives and attachments legitimately constitute an important part of our self-concept as modern human beings. They yearn for inclusion, expression, and recognition. This tension or duality that characterizes our traditional bounded identities brings with it an enormous amount of instability. And depending on where you live in the world, you might have seen this instability express itself in some extremely vivid and palpable crises of social identity in recent years. As these mostly American headlines and editorials, for instance, reflect, this has certainly been the case in the United States, where I mainly live and work, and where proposals for resolving the tensions associated with collective identities have primarily turned to some reconception of liberal nationalism or liberal democracy, I think with very little success. I argue instead that in order to resolve both the stubborn tension and instability that characterizes our bounded identities, that is the problem that I just discussed, and to resolve the apparent tension between human oneness and diversity, that is the problem that we started with, what we need, in fact, is a reimagined universalism, or what I call in some of my work, a reimagined cosmopolitanism. I'm going to make the case that the move to an all-encompassing human identity, in other words, the move to a deeply felt recognition and consciousness of our oneness as human beings, does not represent or reflect just a linear expansion of scope from, say, the national to the global, as is often assumed. I'm claiming rather that a genuinely universal human identity represents a qualitatively distinct and transformative shift that permeates all our identities. In other words, that recasts identities, and relationships at all levels of society, and serves to fundamentally protect and liberate our bounded attachments and affiliations from their otherwise inherent instabilities and contradictions. I'm therefore making the somewhat counterintuitive case that it is only by leaning into a genuine and thickly conceived universalism that the diversity of our particular identities can be fundamentally secured and promoted, and the tension between the universal and the particular be resolved. To make this case, I want to begin by highlighting some of what's impeded our collective thought and imagination, and in particular, universalist thought and theory, from moving in the direction that I'm proposing in this talk. To do this, I'm going to unpack very briefly the conceptual structure and underlying assumption, of one influential universalist school of thought in contemporary Western political philosophy, namely the school of thought known as cosmopolitanism. The term cosmopolitanism has taken on various meanings and connotations in public discourse in recent years. But in contemporary Western political philosophy, cosmopolitan theories typically begin from the universalist premise that all persons have equal moral worth. And from there, they advance a variety of moral, political, and cultural visions for humanity that are universal in scope, that extend beyond the bounds of nation and nationality. Now, if you look closely at this literature, you'll notice that its theories are predominantly shaped by a particular conceptual structure or scaffolding that conceptualizes the cosmopolitan project in terms of a gradual expansion of spatial or territorial scope. What do I mean by this? Well, cosmopolitan theorists typically make the case for expanding the scope of our concern from the national to the global level, and then for extending or replicating at that expanded global level some typically Western thing that has already been established in the domestic national sphere. That thing might be certain norms or principles of distributive justice. It might be institutions of governance and democracy. It might be shared identities and solidarities, and so on. This predominant scope-oriented and sequential conceptual structure, I argue, has had at least three significant implications for how cosmopolitanism, and by extension, universalism more broadly, is conceptualized by political theorists and philosophers, but also more generally. First, cosmopolitanism is thought to represent not a qualitative and thoroughgoing transformation, but rather one more step and an incremental, unidirectional, and linear project of scope expansion. In other words, the cosmopolitan step represents a difference of degree, not of kind. Second, cosmopolitanism's domain of application is thought to be what lies beyond and across borders, not within them. And third, and ironically, what emerges from this conceptual structure is a cosmopolitanism that grants conceptual priority to the particular over the universal in its theorizing. So in these theories, the national or the particular is conceptually privileged. For example, as we just saw, by providing a model to replicate at the global level, or in other cases, by providing the vehicle through which cosmopolitan ends are pursued and achieved. This latter case reflects a concept called rooted cosmopolitanism. The idea being that cosmopolitanism can not only be rooted in, but in fact promoted through the particular. For instance, through an enlightened, globally sensitive form of nationalism, which serves as an effective instrument for the realization of universalist ends, such as, for example, global justice and equality. Notice again that the underlying process posited by these theories extends both chronologically and analytically in a unidirectional fashion from the national to the global. Very rarely is the role of the universal in shaping or transforming the particular considered. The example of the cosmopolitan literature and its conceptual structure helps to demonstrate how certain predominant currents of contemporary thought have obscured the potential power of a genuinely universalist framework and limited our imagination of what the deeply internalized recognition of human oneness can offer. I make the case that a genuinely universal human identity represents not just a linear and sequential expansion of scope, as we just saw, but rather a qualitatively distinct shift that permeates and fundamentally recasts all our identities and relationships. Specifically, I argue that an identity rooted in our common humanity is qualitatively different than every other social identity because of at least two distinguishing features that make it uniquely able to stabilize and empower our other bounded affiliations. The first of these features is rather obviously that it is non-exclusionary. Insofar as human beings and their communities are concerned, an identity rooted in our common humanity has no bounds of exclusion. It literally has no other. This stands in contrast to every other traditional social identity, which is by definition bounded and exclusionary. As a very brief but important footnote to this point, a human identity that is inherently non-exclusionary, as I'm claiming, need not cast humanity in opposition to non-human life on the planet, nor need it entail sharp separation of human beings from their physical environment and ecosystems. Indeed, far from suggesting destructive anthropocentrism, the notion of non-exclusion can actually accommodate and support more expansive conceptions of oneness. I don't have the time to develop this point here, but I do want to note it because I think it's very important. So the second distinguishing feature of an identity based on our shared humanity is what I call its potential non-contingency. Again, consider that virtually all other exclusionary group identities are inescapably socially constructed or contingent. This is not to say, of course, that those identities are not real. It's to observe rather that the commonality in which they are grounded is contingent or dependent on a range of social constructs and impermanent socio-historical phenomena. For example, on our fluid beliefs about social and biological reality, on the frequently contested details of history, on socially constructed parameters of membership, and often tragically on shared experiences of oppression and injustice. I posit that unlike the socio-historically contingent basis of every other identity, the basis of a genuinely cosmopolitan identity need not be socially contingent or constructed. So what exactly do I mean by this? Well, specifically, I'm positing first that there is something distinctive and non-contingent that only and all human beings have in common. Second, that the observable expressions of this human commonality, expressions in the form, for example, of common yearnings, vulnerabilities, and experiences, are such that human beings, whatever their particular context, can come to recognize that a distinctive and non-contingent human core or commonality exists. And third, that human beings are able to readily recognize the humanness of another without a widely articulated consensus on the content of our humanity. In other words, there is or there can be a reasonably widespread intuitive consensus about who falls within the community of human beings. I argue that these two distinguishing features of a genuinely universal social identity that I've posited, that is, its non-exclusionary and potentially non-contingent basis, carry deep implications. To bring these implications into focus, I turn to the notion of security, which is closely associated with the notion of identity in many disciplines. And in particular, I turn to the notion of felt ontological security from psychology, which simply represents one's feeling that her sense of who she is or is not threatened by another person, group, or even more diffuse sources in the environment. I make the case that only a universal human identity has the potential to deliver an overarching context of fundamental security to our other bounded identities. This conclusion, I first of all claim, follows logically from the two distinctive features that I've posited. Consider first that these two features can yield parameters of inclusion that are immovably all-inclusive, parameters that are, in other words, thoroughly stable and safe. In contrast, bounded and contingently grounded identities, that is, all other collective identities, have parameters of membership that are intrinsically susceptible to exclusion and othering. This threat of exclusion, of course, can come from without, that is, it can come from non-members, but significantly, it also comes from within. When parameters of inclusion are intrinsically bounded and socially constructed, the question of who belongs is never fully closed. Insiders one day can be cast as outsiders the next. I think the current discourse and rhetoric around certain national identities very vividly reflects this point. So when parameters of inclusion are bounded and the basis of belonging contingent, the possibility of external threat is never fully eliminated, and one's claim to internal membership is never fully stable. Only a collective identity that is both non-exclusionary and non-contingently grounded, in other words, an identity genuinely rooted in the recognition of our common humanity, can escape these pitfalls and instabilities and deliver a context of fundamental security and belonging. One belongs because one is human, full stop. Now, I think it's important to pause here and to recognize that there are very legitimate worries about casting our humanness in essentialist terms, as I seem to have done here with the premise of non-contingency. Needless to say, the concept of the human has been used to draw extremely destructive hierarchies. It has been used to establish and uphold colonial and neo-colonial structures and practices. What I'm proposing, without having the time to fully discuss it here, is that, in fact, by explicitly positing that the content of a universal human identity must minimally include the recognition of its basis as non-exclusionary and non-contingent, we protect against false accounts of the human that violate these parameters, that exclude or that render the humanity of some contingent and therefore questionable. So this particular formulation of a collective human identity I'm suggesting creates a safe and stable set of parameters within which an open, inclusive, capacious, diverse, and dynamic inquiry into the content and expression of the human can take place. So going back to my core claim, which I briefly drew logically, only a universal human identity has the potential to deliver a stable context of fundamental security to our other traditional identities. Empirical research in social psychology, social and political psychology, also substantiates these propositions in several ways. I'm going to very briefly mention two threads of this evidence here. Research spanning a variety of methods indicates first that identifying with the humanity of others is associated with markedly higher levels of felt security. And second, that felt security relieves intergroup hostility and yields a posture of empathy, care, and openness to outgroups. This is in contrast to the feeling or perception of threat, which is widely shown to increase intergroup hostility. So again, this empirical research taken together suggests that by resituating our particular identities within parameters of inclusion that are safe and immovable and all-inclusive, A universal human identity can relieve the seemingly inherent instabilities of our particular attachments and deliver the context of genuine and enduring security that has long eluded our traditional bounded social identities. The implications of a universal collective identity, I suggest, however, go beyond just relieving particular identities of their destructive and destabilizing potential. What this context of deep, all-pervasive security delivers, I argue, is not just a stable equilibrium of peaceful coexistence. What it delivers, in fact, are optimal conditions for the vibrancy and flourishing of particular identities and of diversity more broadly. The idea here might be briefly put this way. When the cost and encumbrance of insecurity and its associated protective measures are removed on the one hand, and when an open and empathic posture toward difference becomes pervasive on the other, then uninhibited, constructive, and creative expressions of the particular from all sides become much more probable and robust. Defensive goals of survival and collective self-protection, which a context of threat requires, can give way to more generative and constructive goals. So, through the felt security and certainty of belonging that a universal identity provides, other identities find not only protection from their own instability and from the threat of other groups, but also liberation or release from the context of latent threat that has imposed from the weight, the constraining weight that a context of latent threat has imposed on the expression of their potential. A reimagined universal humanity, therefore, can furnish a powerful lubricant for the expression of diversity on newly constituted terms. Now, interestingly, the metaphor that captures this idea is the direct inverse of the metaphor of rooted cosmopolitanism that, as I briefly mentioned, theorists have developed to resolve the tension between the universal and the particular. I'm suggesting that it's not by rooting the universal in the particular, but rather by releasing or liberating the particular through the universal that a fundamental and enduring resolution emerges. What I'm arguing then, somewhat counterintuitively, is that it is by elevating the conceptual priority of the universal over the particular, that is, by leaning into a reimagined and thickly conceived universalism, that the particular thrives, flourishes, and is promoted. And of course, when universalism is conceptualized in these terms, not in spatial or sequential terms, but as a qualitative shift that permeates all spaces and levels of society, then the critique that an identity rooted in the oneness of humankind entails an abstract, rootless, and colorless existence loses its force. The domain of universalism, as I've conceived it, is not exclusively what lies beyond borders, nor is it some distant and elusive abstraction. Its domain, rather, is everywhere. It includes all the textured neighborhoods and communities and countries and identities that each of us as human beings values and belongs to. So to reiterate, notice that what I've suggested here isn't simply that through a universal human identity, we can radically expand the scope of our concern and solidarity or bring more and different people to the same proverbial table, although certainly those are very good things. What I hope to have suggested is that the deeply felt consciousness of the oneness of humankind holds the possibility of an altogether different context within which our identities and relationships are fundamentally recast and transformed. To go back then to the question with which we began, that is the question of social and relational foundations for a new ecosocial contract, what my argument implies isn't simply that a globally inclusive human identity can help support and realize the goals of a globally inclusive social contract without threatening human diversity. What my argument implies is that an identity rooted in the oneness of humankind has the potential to fundamentally transform the relationships and identities that constitute our world, opening up the possibility of an altogether different ecosocial reality that embodies and expresses the fundamental oneness and essential diversity of humankind. Thank you.